So I hope everybody or every couple of people got the study sheets. I'm going to read the poems out loud, but I think it's always easier to be able to see things, see it in front of you. I might have an extra one. All right, somebody share with Dan. So, sometimes, I don't know, something happens that, which happened to me many years ago, and it's kind of stuck in my mind every single high holiday period. Okay, so they're bringing study sheets for anybody. If you need one, just hold your hand up. For viewers at home, they were emailed to you earlier this week. So, I don't know, I was probably maybe in my second or third year at the congregation in the dark recesses of the past. And I don't even remember what the sermon was, but I remember a congregant coming up to me afterwards and said, "Okay, I got it. You wanted to talk about women." And clearly I never forgot. But I'm sure I gave a Devar Torah on the theme of our high holiday service, which you cannot not see, which is the voice of our matriarchs and other Jewish women. Yesterday, we hear about Sarah. We hear about Hagar, even though she's not one of our matriarchs. Yesterday's Haftarah is Hannah crying and begging for a child. This morning, we heard from our matriarch, Rachel. The voice of our matriarchs is very strong. The theme of women wanting children, losing children, praying for children. I suspect part of the reason, I don't know if anybody is familiar with this tradition, but when we say a mishaberach for a person, traditionally we say their Hebrew name and the daughter or son of the mother, which is very unusual in our tradition. We're always identified traditionally as the children of our father, but in a mishaberach prayer, it is the prayer, the son or daughter of the mother, and the reasons that the rabbis give, and it's a wish, is that God would have compassion on the mother, more compassion perhaps for a mother than a father, and heal this mother's sick child. So it'd be great if it really worked that way, but in any ways, that's sort of the hope, anyways. And so this morning, we're going to look at sort of that theme that kind of runs through the poetry about God perhaps having more compassion on a mother. This morning, though I said the voice of women is very, very strong throughout our Torah reading and our Haftorah, Sarah's voice is non-existent in this morning's Torah reading. Right? God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son, the son that you love, the son that we just read yesterday. Sarah laughs in joy and calls the son Yitzchak, laughter. And where is Sarah this morning? Not in the story at all. That allows the rabbinic imagination to try to fill in the blanks. Where would Sarah have been? Did she know? Did she not know? How would she feel when she heard what happened? Because inevitably, whether Abraham actually had fulfilled this original command and came back without Isaac, or even as the case may be, Isaac comes back, Sarah finds out what happens. Story in the Torah is silent. However, when we read this in the Torah cycle, right after we read the binding of Isaac, the very next parsha is Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, which begins with her death. And so the rabbis say, why is the death of Sarah right after the binding of Isaac? Because when she hears what almost happens, she dies. So I want to look at just a little bit of, we're going to look at a little bit of just one piece of ancient midrash, a piece that's almost 2,000 years old, to see that the rabbis were really struggling and trying to bring voice to Sarah and to her pain. By the way, there are midrashim, I didn't bring them, that Sarah says to Abraham, good for you. If this is what God wants, this is what we should do. So not all of them are Sarah as this suffering mother. Some of them are Sarah as the rabbis want to raise her up as a woman of faith, equal to Abraham. But there are also obviously midrashim that picture her very differently. So the first one I just want to look at briefly is from Pirkei to Rabbi Eliezer. It, as I said, is almost 2,000 years old. When Abraham returned from Mount Moriah in peace, the anger of Samael was kindled. So there, in our rabbinic tradition, there's belief that there are angels. There are good angels and there are bad angels. And this is an angel that would have been against us. He saw that the desire of his heart to frustrate the offering of our father Abraham had not been realized. So again, don't look for this in the Torah. It's not there. But there's this idea that there's an angel that's disappointed that, that Isaac comes out of this alive. And so he goes to Sarah and he said, "Hast thou not heard what has happened in the world?" She said to him, "No." He said to her, "Thy husband Abraham has taken thy son Isaac and slain him and offered him up as a burnt offering upon the altar." So, of course, this is not what happens, but he tells her this. And what happens when she hears this? She began to weep and to cry aloud 3 times, corresponding to the 3 sustained notes of the shofar. So there are many reasons given for why we sound a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but one of them is from what we read this morning in the Torah portion that I know you all read along. Where is the shofar in that story? Where is the ram? The ram appears in the thicket, and Abraham sacrifices the ram instead of Isaac. And so when we blow the horn, when we blow the shofar, one of the things that we're supposed to think about is Abraham's willingness, his great faith to follow God's command, but at the same time, the fact that Isaac was spared. What I love about this midrash is it tells us when we hear the sound of the shofar, we should also be thinking about Sarah and about the reaction of a mother in hearing either a faulty report or even hearing after the fact of what almost happened, that the shofar reminds us of the cry of a mother who almost lost her child. So now we're going to look at just some various Hebrew poetry that's going to all focus on Sarah. By the way, there is Hebrew poetry that focuses on the ram. Yehuda Amichai has a poem about the ram, like why does nobody care about him? But there's not a lot of poetry about the ram, so we're not going to do a whole thing on that. So the first person that we're going to look at is Yehudit Kafri. Yehudit Kafri was born in 1935. She was a kibbutznik, grew up on a kibbutz. Her parents were founding members of kibbutz Ein HaChorash, and she was one of the first sort of generation of children who were born on that kibbutz. And this poem was from a collection that was published in 1962. In the beginning. Through our dim beginnings, the story trickles down. Father, his son, and the knife. How did it happen, and where was Sarai? How could she trust such a tyrannical God who would defend at the last moment? Why did she not cry out earlier when he had just saddled the donkey and loaded the wood? Do not raise your hand to the lad. Why did she not stop him midway, whispering through clenched lips, "You will not pass this way as long as I am alive, not this child, the one we have waited for 100 years, not this child of our soul, not the child who is the core of our being." So why didn't she do this? You can shout out, but loud, because you got masks on. Lynn? But the simple thing is she probably didn't know. Like, we're not told in the Torah that she knew. She knew that he would, she had the faith that Abraham would do the right thing in the end. Could have been fear. But let's imagine if she did know, right? Let's imagine if she did. Okay, we're going to give her the benefit of the doubt she didn't know. But that poignant cry, right? Why didn't she say to him, "Not this child. We waited 100 years. Not this child. You're not taking this child." Just keep that in mind when we get to the last poem, right? Don't take this child. Yes. So he's the child on loan. Look, people, I think it's hard I think every generation, there is more written about this story in the Torah than any other story in the Torah, because generations have struggled with this. It's an act of faith, but what kind of faith? What kind of parent would do this? But in ancient society, people sacrifice children, right? Our Torah comes to say, don't do that. But the idea that God would expect that of you in ancient times was not really an unusual idea. So a lot of this plays with this. Is it faith? Is it not faith? Should she have stopped? But for somebody who's writing in 1962, the idea that you would sort of throw yourself in front of, to stop this. But remember, also you have to read this in the backdrop of Israeli society, who sent their children to war over and over and over. And we're going to look at a prayer that was written during the Lebanon War. But really, until the Lebanon War, people didn't stand up and say, no, we're not doing this. We're not sending our children. As a matter of fact, we're going to skip Chava. Yeah, right. I don't know what that means. The shofar was better. Maybe it's Chava Yaakov saying, why are you going to skip my poem? But we're going to skip her poem. You can read it later. But let's look at the next one, is Raya Hernick. So what's sad and interesting about Raya Hernick is that she lost a son in the Lebanon War. And she became a leading critic of then Prime Minister Menachem Begin and his Lebanon policy. And if you remember, there were a lot of very prolonged. It's not on at all? Okay. If you remember anything about the Lebanon War, I'm afraid I'm going to blow that one too. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. If you remember anything about, I hope they can hear me on live stream. If you can remember anything about the Lebanon War, is that it sparked over time large protests in Israel, mostly led by mothers against the war. It was the first time in Israel that nobody protested 1967, nobody protested in 48, nobody protested in 73, but the Lebanon War was a different war. It was not really, they might have tried to argue that it was a defensive war, but many people didn't see it that way. And she said she got a lot of criticism, as you can imagine, for criticizing the government and trying to stop the war. And she said in all previous wars, there was a belief that this great enterprise required sacrifices. And so as long as society believed in the righteousness of the path and the good faith of the political and military leadership, families could accept bereavement. So before this, prior to this, it was a horrible sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice that one had to make. The Lebanon War really changed that very dramatically in Israeli society, much like Vietnam did here. That the idea that, that there are wars that your government should not be conducting. And so this is a poem that she wrote. I will not sacrifice. I will not sacrifice my firstborn, not I. At night, God and I are calculating who gets what. I know, I am grateful, but not my son, and not as a sacrifice. Fortunately, of course, she did sacrifice her son, but look how she couches it in the words of the in the Akedah. Part of what I love about Israeli poetry is almost all of it is written by people that we would consider secular. They're not religious people. There's, on the whole, most modern Israeli poetry. And yet the language is language of the Torah. The language is the language of sacrifice and the binding of Isaac. One of the things that Rachel Korazim showed us in a class was in front of one of the big theaters, not movie theaters, but one of the Tel Aviv theater. The Susan Dalal Center, right? There's a theater. It's the museum. There's a museum there, and there's also, I think it's the library. And in the middle of the square, there is a big sculpture. And the sculpture is of the ram and the binding of Isaac. And this is like the center of secular Tel Aviv. This is not, in front of a synagogue. It's not in front of a religious institution. So the idea, again, that this motif that runs through Israeli society. So let's look at after. She wrote it after. So let's look at another, Benjamin Galai. He is a little bit, predates this. He went with his family to Israel, then Palestine in 1926, lived in Tel Aviv, moved in Haifa, and he was a press advisor to the municipality. And he writes, and the life of Sarah was. He also lost a son in war. And the life of Sarah was 120 years and 7 years, and Sarah died. She departed of this world at Mount Hebron with the pitter-patter of servants' feet, whose names she had forgotten. All the family friends accompanied, shouldered her coffin to the last resting place. It was heard that its planks were thinner than thin, light, oh so light. And the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. The years of Sarah, and Sarah died. But truthfully, her candle was extinguished many years earlier, before her last place of rest was dust, and the coffin in which she lay was made all these years of the memory of the wood split on another mountain in the land of Moriah. Right? Her coffin is the memory of the wood for the sacrifice. Right? Abraham saddles the donkey, he loads it with wood, because the sacrifice needs to be not just killed, but it needs to be burned. And so her coffin is, though she dies many, many years later, her real death and the real coffin, that light coffin, is made from the wood of the almost sacrifice of Isaac. Anybody want to say anything about that? Yes. Okay. We don't know, right? We don't know. Look, as I said, we don't know if she knew, eventually she found out, right? Like eventually where have you been all day? Eventually she found out. We don't know. Yes, these poems give Sarah a voice. But what I think is so powerful is that we have rabbinic texts that are 2,000 years old that also give Sarah a voice. But as I said, some of them, I didn't bring a poem because it doesn't focus on Sarah that I actually love. About the Akedah, which was written by Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who was politically very right-wing. But in that poem, he says, I wish that God would tell me to sacrifice my son. And it sounds very shocking to hear that. But what he's saying is I have to perhaps sacrifice my son without a voice from God. So would that at least I knew, right, that I was being commanded to do this by God. Because one way or the other, my children are going to the army. So now I saved the most interesting one for last. And we're going to read it first, and then I'm going to tell you who wrote it. If I Were a Jewish Mother, written by Ayat Abu Shmais, and maybe her name will give this away. If I were a Jewish mother, and I needed to send my son to the army, I would fight, I would bind my tongue to his ears, I would glue my hands to his legs, I would hang my heart on his eyes, just so he wouldn't go. Now, who is she? She is an Arab Israeli. She was born in Jaffa, in Yaffo. Her mother actually was illiterate and insisted that her children get the best and broadest education possible. She speaks 5 languages: Arabic, Hebrew, French, English, and Spanish. She's the second of 4 children. Her first book of poetry came out in both Arabic and Hebrew in 2018, but this is what is so fascinating by her. She mostly writes in Hebrew. And she's constantly asked about this choice, and this is what she says. Well, you can imagine that people have accused her of, some people see her as a traitor for writing in Hebrew, right? For writing in Hebrew, the language of, colonizers, that it's totally inappropriate, and she's gotten a lot of criticism. So she says that, and she does say it is a form of occupation, writing in the language of the occupier, but that it came naturally for her to write in Hebrew. To her, Arabic is a holy language, the language of the Quran, and she would be diminishing it by writing her everyday thoughts and feelings. So she does write about her Palestinian identity. Nonetheless, she's an Arab Israeli who writes, or Palestinian Israeli who writes in Hebrew. But to think about her as if I were a Jewish mother, right? What would I do before I would send my own son to war? Like, I would glue myself to him. But what's fascinating is she uses a phrase, I would bind. I would bind. Like this is not a coincidence, right? That this is reference to the binding of Isaac. Like the Hebrew poet, she would do anything if she were a Jewish mother to stop her child from going to war. So these are just, yes, Vera. Right, absolutely, it's a necessity. Israeli parents are not leaving Israel in droves the year their oldest turned 17. Right, everybody understands. All of our friends that live in Israel, our friends that live here, who've had their children serve in the army, they're proud of their children. They understand this is a necessity. But what are they thinking in the middle of the night? What are they thinking in the middle of the night? Please, God, like, not this child. Please. If I could stop them by, holding on to their leg. There was an article that was written many years, maybe 10 years ago, that I read about Israeli mothers, even the most, professional, worked their whole lives, never baked a cookie in their life. When their kids go to the army, all of a sudden they're baking cookies and they're sending boxes of cookies. And when their kids come home, they're doing their laundry because they don't know what else they can do. Right? They don't know what else they can do. So yes, of course it's a necessity. Every Israeli parent that lives in Israel, raises children in Israel, understands it's a necessity. But that doesn't make them stop from thinking in the middle of the night, if I could only wrap my arm around your leg and keep you from leaving the house, I would. Dan. It's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know. And that is what is so fascinating about her saying if she was a Jewish mother. Because she did not say, if I was a Palestinian mother, I would do this before my child went out and did these various things. So this is you can imagine what a controversial poem this is in her own community. Dan, and then we don't know. I don't know. If I can find out, I'll let you know next year. Susan, were you going to? You know what? I don't know if she's a mother. I don't know. Well, okay. I'll find out and I'll report back. I'm not an expert in Israeli poetry, so I can't really speak to that per se. I will say, though, I've thought about this a lot over the years. I don't know how popular this is now, but if you listen to Israeli popular music from the 60s, from the 70s, probably even even probably more current, the number of songs that are written about the hope for peace, right? If not today, then tomorrow. So I don't know how it expresses itself in poetry, but certainly for a generation of popular Israeli songs, there are an inordinate number of songs written about the hope for peace, which I don't think is mirrored on the other side. So I don't know if it's a choice to go to the army. I mean, that's their. Right. By the way, there are midrashim, 2,000 years old, that have Isaac saying, bind me. I'm here. I'm ready. There are midrashim that want to see this zealous faith on the part of all of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. And a lot of it really depends on the period that it was written in. In early Christianity, there is midrashim that talk about, we also were willing to sacrifice. So it really, there are prayers that were written during the Islamic conquest that talk about, oh, Ishmael, Ishmael's bragging that he got circumcised at 13, and Isaac's like, well, you got circumcised at 13. Guess what I was willing to do? So they very, very much reflect poetry, rabbinic teaching, very much reflects the period that it was written in. So the period after Lebanon is going to sound very different than a poem that was written in 1948. One of the most famous Israeli poems in all of history is The Silver Platter, written by Natan Alterman, right, where these young people, seemingly returning from the front, right, with tattered clothes and covered in dust, and people say, "Who are you?" And they say, "We are the silver platter on which the state was given to you." It's a very famous poem in Israel. A mother after the Lebanon War is not going to write a poem like that, right? That's not her experience anymore. And so it's very much reflective of the time that people are living in. And that's why I wonder, like, songs about hope for peace probably aren't written as often today in Israel because people are very tired and weary. Right. Right. That's right. Right. It's a perspective of, right, the ram's like, who asked him? Like, this poor ram shows up, gets caught in a thicket. Who asked him? Of course, it's not really about a ram, right? It's about people that get caught up in situations where it's going on over there, but you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And well, anyways, I'll share that poem with you. All right. Yes, Vera. Yeah. So David Grossman, who's a famous, well-known Israeli writer, journalist, and he also lost a son. So, the mother who runs away from the news. All right, you know what? We could do this all day. But it's not Yom Kippur and lunch. People might. So listen. I think that, as I said, I don't know if we are going to be back here like this next year. But the lovely thing to be able to have a little bit of a dialogue, during services. So I'm sorry that we didn't get to everybody, but you will thank me at 12:30.